So,
for those who argue in favor of EU membership, what do you think is their strongest argument?
well, it used to be the economics of it, but they've lost that now because they know that the British business has sussed that access to the marketplace is not worth the regulations that come with it, especially given that countries outside, like Switzerland and Norway, have the same market access without the same additional cost. So they've fallen back on the only argument they've got. They've fallen back on the thinking from Jean Monnet onwards that was behind the project, and just like communism was, or Soviet communism was, you know, it's very often the case that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. All right? Imagine if you were French. It's a very difficult thing to do, I know. But imagine if you were, you know, and 1945 comes along. You know, you've just been through two catastrophic, disastrous world wars. One in which your country has absolutely ripped to shreds, and another in which, you know, the psychological damage that's been done to you by the cohabitation with Vichy and all the rest of it. I mean, you know, and if someone comes along with a theory that says, if we have a union with Germany, there'll never be another war, well, my goodness me, you can see that's a very tempting idea, can't you? Very tempting idea after what you've been through and after what Europe had gone through. So that was the original thinking behind it, and now, in any debate on EU membership, they will always fall back on, well, of course, we need the EU because it guarantees the peace. All right? Now, my answer to that is this, that if, without the consent of the peoples, you take away from them their democracy, their identity, their ability to determine their own futures, that if you do that to them, far from creating peace, you are far more likely to stir up all sorts of civil disorders and potential problems for the future. And the best example I can give you of that is the thinking that happened post-Versailles with the Treaty of Paris in 1920, when the great and the good said, look, we can't have all these ridiculous little Balkan countries with their own tin pot princes and their own parliaments and their own currencies, and this is absolutely hopeless. We can't have them going around shooting each other, causing world wars. We've got a solution for the Balkans. We're going to call it Yugoslavia. And we're going to give them one currency, and one government, and one flag, and one anthem, and one army, and once we've done that, there'll never be war again in the Balkans. Well, they might have held it together under communism and Tito, but once it had gone, and once he'd gone, we've seen things like the Srebrenica massacre. We saw Kosovo just last year declaring its own independence, and nobody would be brave enough and bold enough to predict that we hadn't seen the last of problems in the Balkans, as they now fight and are prepared to die to get back the states they had pre the Treaty of Paris. You can only federate. You can only do these things with the full-hearted consent of the peoples involved, and in this European project, that has been absent from the very beginning. They've never told us the truth about any of this, and even when people in referendums have the temerity to vote no, they're told they've got it wrong and they're asked to vote again. Not a recipe, sir, I would suggest, for peace and harmony long term.
At a practical level, what do you see as the best strategy for a party like UKIP? Is it, in fact, to try to influence the national government through national elections and attempt to effect a withdrawal from the EU? Or do you think there's something to be said for cooperation with other Eurosceptic parties within the European Parliament to attempt to dismantle the mechanisms of power of the EU internally?
I cooperate with the other Eurosceptic group, the other reasonable Eurosceptic groups.
And the second part to that question, which sort of parties, anti-immigration, regional autonomy, green, whatever parties do you see the UKIP having most in common with?
Look, I cooperate, have done for nearly 11 years in the European Parliament. I cooperate with other Eurosceptic groups in that Parliament. But it's becoming increasingly hard to do so. Because what's happening is the reaction to this, and it's back to the last question, the reaction to this is becoming increasingly extreme. It's becoming increasingly, I mean, I could, align with the Greek Communist Party. I mean, they're more anti-EU than I am, but I'd rather not. Certainly, and there's nobody in this room who's a libertarian that would either. Equally, I don't find the Hungarian Nationalist Party, Jobbik, who've got their own sort of brown shirt uniform, particularly attractive either. And that's the problem. People feel their identity is being taken away. People feel their democracy is being taken away, and they're tending to move to the extremes. Luckily, there are still sufficient people that we can work with as UKIP, and I'm now leading a group in the Parliament of 33 MEPs, and yeah, we'll work with them, but in reality, we're not going to win this or get this changed in the European Parliament. I mean, you know, the mechanism there doesn't exist. The single most realistic way that we win, and it's back to this question here, but the single most realistic way in which we win is for our arguments to command such a tidal wave of public support that a British government has to give the British people a referendum so that we can decide our own future. And I'll tell you this, provided it was a free and fair referendum, and that is very important, particularly after the monstrous behaviour in Ireland recently by the broadcasters and the Yes side, but I mean, let's not go into that too deeply, but if a majority of my fellow Britons decided that I was wrong, decided they wanted to live in a new United States of Europe, I wouldn't like that, but I'd be prepared to accept it, because that decision would have been arrived at democratically. But what I am not prepared to accept, and why I've packed up a career in business to come and do all this nonsense, is I'm not prepared to accept a group of utterly gutless, spineless, useless career politicians in our two main parties who've led us up the garden path on this for over 3 decades without ever having the courage to tell us the truth about their intentions or ever consulting me. I've never been asked to express my opinion on this, and I will fight against the so-and-sos as long as I can. If the British people don't want it, I can live with it. I won't like it, but I'm not having it done to me just by politicians. And that's my main motivation.
To find out more about who we are and what we stand for, go to the UK Independence Party website at www.ukip.org.